Around 5,000 years ago, one of the largest and most powerful empires in history emerges on the banks of the Nile. Ancient Egypt. Monumental temples, tombs and metropolises bear witness to the power of this fascinating civilization. Yet Egyptian culture is also considered strange and mysterious to this day. International researchers explain the world of the godlike pharaohs and the everyday life of their subjects. The Egyptian Empire endured for 3,000 years. What is the secret of success of this advanced civilization on the Nile? The belief in a life after death and the cult of the deceased are central to the world of the ancient Egyptians.
The word mummy is almost synonymous with ancient Egypt.
Mummies bear witness to this millennia-old world and its mysteries.
It is said that the ancient Egyptians had an obsession with death. What they actually had was an obsession with life.
The more we learn about the death cult of the ancient Egyptians, the better we understand their lives. "7,000 years ago, people settled on the narrow green strip along the Nile. Villages and metropolises emerge. They bury their dead beyond the fertile land of their settlements, in the sands of the desert, where extreme aridity and heat prevail. Then they discover that the hostile climate of the Egyptian desert has a fascinating effect on the dead. Instead of decomposing, the body is dried out by the hot, salty sand and is preserved. It's the starting point for a cult of the dead that has lasted for thousands of years. A cult based on the belief that eternal life in the hereafter is only possible through a preserved body in this world.
The desert provided place for burial grounds where the Egyptian hoped that things would last for eternity. The tomb was called Per Jet, which means house of eternity. They knew it wouldn't be possible in the Nile Valley, anywhere in the silt. The valley flooded every year from late June until late September, October. It was the inundation season, and there's no way you could preserve a body, in the Nile Valley. So the desert provided the ideal conditions for cemeteries.
At the end of the 19th century, 40 kilometers south of Luxor and Thebes, excavators come upon a sensation. In the ancient village of Gebelin, they find 6 mummies, about 5,400 years old. For Egyptologists, they're the first indication of the origins of the art of embalming. For a long time, archaeologists attributed their near-perfect state of preservation to the salty desert sand. They dried out the corpses and preserved them. However, there are new findings.
The thing about the Gebelin mummies, they're very interesting. What we can say is that with the Gebelin mummies, the hot, dry sand was certainly playing a key role in the preservation of these individuals. That's absolutely certain. But we also know that actually some of these, at least, were actually being wrapped in linen that included antibacterial tree resins that were actually also playing a part in body preservation in addition to the hot, dry sand. So for the Egyptians, the preservation of the body was absolutely central to immortality.
So the ancient Egyptians' desire for eternal life is much older than the pyramids. Near the great cities along the Nile, they build necropolises, cities of the dead. One of the most important is located at Saqqara. For more than 150 years, the site has been a treasure trove for archaeologists, telling them ever more about the art of embalming and the cult of the dead. In an area of about 10 square kilometers, there are numerous tombs, and researchers are still discovering new ones. The royal tombs act as a kind of nucleus. Even in death, proximity to the king is paramount, although strictly according to hierarchy. In the immediate vicinity lie the ruler's relatives. Beyond them, high dignitaries. Further away, lower officials may find their final resting place. In 2003, archaeologists find 20 graves of civil servants from the time of King Nama, considered the first pharaoh around 3000 BC. One of the officials was buried in a wooden coffin. It's a status symbol for the wealthy elite. Yet, this new burial method poses new challenges for embalmers.
So during the pre-dynastic period, the hot, dry sand, with certainly in some of these cases, an embalming recipe preserved the bodies fairly well, and the elite needed to show that they were elite. This is when the burial environment, the tomb, changed. The body was no longer in direct contact with the hot, dry sand. So that necessarily meant that the bodies would decompose far more rapidly. So because of this, they actually needed to have a much more elaborate mummification process.
At the beginning of the Old Kingdom, embalmers rely on antibacterial resins to slow down the decomposition process. Linen wrapping is supposed to preserve the body close to life. Male genitals, and in women the breasts, are artfully modelled. So are ears, nose, mouth and eyes. Yet, from this period, only a few mummies have survived. One of them is in a museum in Hildesheim, Germany. In 1914, German excavators find a coffin near the pyramids of Giza. It belongs to an official of the 6th dynasty. His name was Idu. It's the start of an adventurous journey for him.
Underneath the rubble of a mastaba, archaeologists discovered an access shaft that led to an underground burial chamber. When they opened it, they saw a wonderful cedar coffin. The mummy was still inside. It was the oldest Egyptian mummy found at that time. It was brought overland to Cairo and on to Alexandria. It was then transported by sea to Germany. Alas, when it arrived, it was in a sorry state.
It wasn't until 2016 that researchers were able to reconstruct Idu's head with the help of the latest technology and a sculptor. This is what the Egyptian official might have looked like 4,000 years ago. Idu served Pharaoh Pepi II as a chamberlain and scribe. Thanks to modern technology, scientists learn a good deal more about the burial rites of his time.
The mummy of Idu has revolutionized our understanding of mummification. It's the oldest Egyptian mummy ever on which we can prove that sodium bicarbonate was used not only to dry out the internal organs, but to remove moisture from the entire body. So even in very early times, the Egyptians tried to preserve human bodies as best as they could. It was believed that the non-physical component of a human being could only live on if there was a physical anchor point in this world. And for that, the body had to be preserved.
So preserving the entire body is indispensable. Even before the unification of the empire, when deceased were still mummified by the salty desert sand, the people of the Nile tried to further body preservation with resin-soaked linen bandages. The way tombs of the Old Kingdom prevented natural mummification by desert sand, the Egyptians had to refine their techniques to allow their deceased to live on. Throughout the millennia, Egyptians continued to embellish their ideas about the afterlife. As early as the Old Kingdom, proper mummification and the performing of appropriate burial rites are indispensable. Only via them can the pharaoh ascend to heaven, where he may then rule alongside the other gods, ensuring that his subjects too will go on to exist after death, living an existence without worries in what is to them the beautiful West. It's a parallel world in which everyone gets a fertile piece of land, providing bread, cakes and beer in abundance. A paradise where Osiris rules, the god of the dead. Their cult of the dead is supposed to help the Egyptians achieve this goal. The main site of this cult is Abydos, 400 kilometers south of Saqqara. Here, archaeologists uncovered more than 650 tombs. According to the belief of the ancient Egyptians, it's also the site where Osiris is buried. Year after year, the Egyptians come here to participate in celebrations in Osiris's honor, commemorating his death as well as his resurrection. It's said that Osiris once ruled Egypt, until his brother Seth murdered him and scattered his remains throughout the land. However, Osiris's wife and sister, the goddess Isis, succeeds in reuniting his body and reviving him. Since then, Osiris reigns as ruler of eternity and god of rebirth. No sinner who wants to enter the beautiful West will get past him.
Abydos is one of the oldest sites where we encounter an extensive burial ground, complete with royal tombs. Because a king who dies, passes into the afterlife and unites with the gods there, simply must have sort of an opposite pole in this world. So people who lived under this king continue to need him as a means of contact, even if there is a new king. During this period, an entire series of conceptions and rituals develops, which, over the centuries, will play an important role in Egypt.
And so, even in early dynastic times, the Egyptians conceived the royal tombs of Abydos as oases of well-being for departed souls. The large burial chambers have stairways and false doors, enabling the souls to leave the tomb. Until then, their well-being must be taken care of. In addition to bread and wine, even weapons and furniture are buried with them. When the tomb is sealed, a large mound of earth is heaped over it, symbolizing the primordial mound. According to the Egyptians' creation myth, the primordial mound rose from the primordial sea and became the foundation of all life. Over time, the symbolic mound takes on more abstract forms, culminating in the pyramid. As can be seen particularly well in the tombs of Saqqara. Here we find underground galleries, but also so-called mastabas, rectangular burial structures. The necropolis is topped by the oldest of all Egyptian pyramids, the Step Pyramid of Pharaoh Djoser, about 4,700 years old. Yet the crowning of Egyptian funerary architecture are the pyramids of Giza. They're the only one of the 7 ancient wonders of the world still standing. Monuments that have testified to the glory of their builders for over 4,500 years. Yet for the pharaohs, the pyramids weren't merely ostentatious tombs. A pyramid also serves as a kind of resurrection machine that enables the deceased pharaohs to take their place among the gods. From here, the kings of the Old Kingdom begin their journey into the afterlife. Their souls can henceforth switch between the world of the living and that of the dead, with their pyramids as a door either way. In this world, the Egyptians erect magnificent funerary temples for their deceased kings. Priests offer sacrifices here and preserve the memory of the godlike kings. hoping that the souls of the deceased pharaohs will watch over the destinies of Egypt. The mortuary temple of Pharaoh Seti I in Abydos is particularly impressive, a site that commemorates the union of the deceased with the gods. The ancient Egyptians believed that their spiritual being consists not of one, but of three souls: Ka, Ba, and Ak, or Ahu. Two arms stretched up symbolize Ka. He's the spiritual double of the deceased, the part which made him human, so Ka always remains near the corpse. Other than Ba, this so-called free soul is the part that can wander between this world and the hereafter. Thus, it's often depicted as an eagle with a human head. The third soul, Ak, is created only after death. Its evocation is the most important goal of the rituals of the dead. For only through Ak, whose symbol is an ibis, can the deceased be resurrected in the afterlife. Similar to the saints of the Catholic Church, the souls of the dead assume an intermediary role between humans and the gods. To ensure this, relatives must regularly replenish the food supply of the deceased and care for his grave. Decay, desecration, or neglect of the corpse will drive away the souls, thus extinguishing the deceased for good. In some graves, messages have been preserved, written by the bereaved to their dead relatives. They offer rare insights into the beliefs of the Egyptians. They relate that the deceased has now attained a more carefree existence, but still has influence over events in this world. It's a highly personal correspondence. There are requests for protection for the writer's family, expressions of love, but also requests not to forget the duties to those left behind. Fewer than 20 of these messages have been discovered so far. However, they date from all periods and attest to the popularity of this practice.
The letters to the dead, these letters that are left on stones and pottery, they indicate that the reason for setting you up after you die with the Ahu, the resurrected spirits, and the Netru, the gods, is so that you could be an intermediary and ensure that, say, your daughter, if you're a deceased parent, that your daughter will be pregnant by her husband so your estate can live on.
The soul is an ambassador between the worlds. At the beginning of the Middle Kingdom, the Egyptians used death masks to make sure that the soul will find its corpse in this world. Then coffin lids reproduced the bodily shape of the deceased and have remained the typical image of an Egyptian coffin to this day. Underneath, more and more layers of linen envelop the body, all in an effort to preserve the corpse in the best possible way. During the Middle Kingdom, sodium bicarbonate becomes widely used for preservation. At the University of Zurich, Frank Rühli has been studying the importance of sodium bicarbonate for mummification for over 15 years. According to tradition, the Egyptians used a naturally occurring salt mixture composed of sodium chloride, sodium carbonate, sodium bicarbonate, and sodium sulfate. The Egyptians extracted it in Wadi el Natrun, a desert valley in northwestern Egypt, hence our word natron. The correct mixing ratio was long unknown and could only be determined by experimentation. While a few kilograms of sodium bicarbonate are sufficient for today's experiments on animal organs, researchers believe that back then, several dozen kilograms of the mixture were used in the mummification of a corpse. In a special oven, the dry Egyptian climate is simulated. The objects under study are stored in it for a few days. Another substance used for preservation is bitumen, which the Egyptians imported from Palestine. It gives numerous mummies their black appearance. Frank Rulli and his colleague Patrick Eppenberger use it to produce perfectly mummified body parts. By using imaging techniques such as a mobile X-ray machine, the mystery of the correct sodium mixture could be solved. The team was able to preserve the tissue structure. Yet, what can real mummies tell us about the ancient Egyptians?
Mummies are bodies in which the soft parts have been preserved, or at least parts of them. And that allows us much more than, in quotation marks, just a skeleton to learn something about the life and the health condition of a person, maybe even about medical treatments. That's important information if we want to learn about the evolution of medicine and disease.
Mummies are unique archives of life. Research these days also uses equipment that would normally be used on living patients. State-of-the-art CT scans allow researchers to look inside mummies without damaging them. At this examination, the researchers find out that the deceased was a man who died at the age of 30. He was well fed and apparently also paid attention to his oral hygiene. Since, unlike many of his contemporaries, his dental state was excellent. Frank Rulli and his team have evaluated the medical records of more than 3,000 mummies and can tell what the Egyptians suffered from back then.
The ancient Egyptians had a good many diseases which are known to us too. There is an amazing number of vascular calcifications. We also see a lot of degenerative diseases, since some of them had to work very hard physically. Compared to today, we see significantly fewer tumors or cancers. As for the so-called upper class, it must be said that infections or dental diseases are quite common. So we see that life was quite different, and that the upper class also suffered from such things.
Since 2021, the National Museum of Egyptian Civilization in Cairo has been home to the mummies of 18 pharaohs and 4 pharaohesses. The most famous among them, the mummy of Ramses II. In 1976, it was scientifically examined in Paris. Back then, Ramses II is received like a head of state. The examination of the mummy has revealed a host of information about the life of an extraordinary pharaoh. Ramses II, it's believed, attained an exceptionally advanced age of over 90 years. To his subjects, he must have seemed like an immortal god. A stiffened back tells us that Ramses could probably only walk in pain and with the help of a cane. Even the color of his hair could be determined. It was reddish. Graying with age, he dyed it with henna. Yet vanity isn't just the prerogative of pharaohs. The priest Nesyamun, who died about 3,000 years ago, had it written on his coffin that he hoped his voice would one day be heard again. In 2016, a team of researchers in Leeds, England, set out to fulfill this wish.
What we're able to achieve is, as I say, in the same way that modern individuals have their speech recreated, was to CT scan his vocal tract and recreate that, 3D printed, and from that, using some electronics, recreate the sound that that particular vocal tract would have made, because each of our vocal tracts are unique.
Thanks to the well-preserved mummy and the latest technology, the replica of its respiratory tract, larynx and vocal tract makes it possible to make Nesyamun's voice be heard again, if only with a single sound. Since the larynx has shrunk due to mummification, the voice sounds very bright. Yet Nesyamun's wish came true. As early as the foundation of the Pharaonic Empire, the Egyptians had contact with peoples beyond their borders. With Libyans, Canaanites, Akkadians, Jamaicadians, Nubians or Hattians. At the end of the Middle Kingdom, central rule breaks down, and the empire disintegrates again into smaller kingdoms and principalities. Warlords from the northeast, the so-called Hyksos, conquer the Nile Delta and rule over it for most of the so-called Second Intermediate Period. A mummy from this era is that of Pharaoh Seqenenre, which has long puzzled researchers. At the end of the Second Intermediate Period, around the year 1550 BC, Seqenenre rules over a large area in the southern part of Egypt. His rule is overshadowed by the struggle against the Hyksos, the foreign rulers of the north. Did Seqenenre fall in a campaign while trying to recapture the Nile Delta from the Hyksos?
Seqenenre Tao's mummy was fascinating because when it was first studied in the end of the 19th century, they unwrapped it because those days X-raying was not quite as simple as it is today. And they found that poor Seqenenre had his hands like this in an awful attitude. His mouth was a little bit twisted, and he had damage, which was made by weapons, all over his face and parts of his body.
The wounds to the torso were indeed from a fight, yet not fatal. Researchers believe that Seqenenre's death was caused by the multiple head injuries. But how does the strange position of his hands fit with a violent death? The scenario, according to recent investigations. At the instant of his death, Seqenenre is kneeling, his hands tied behind his back. The Hyksos presumably had captured him during a battle. Without much ado, the pharaoh is executed with several axe blows to his head. His body is mummified as befits his status. However, a crucial part is missing.
It seems now, by studying some of these X-rays and CT scans, that maybe the heart was removed or missing because he was not mummified very well at first, because he died on the battlefield. I think that the embalmers made a mistake. So it's a very interesting thing that this mummy that we have known since the 19th century is continuing to unfold part of its story, and by using new technology, we are learning more and more about his death.
By Seqenenre's time, the Egyptians have been practicing mummification for over 1,500 years. In the beginning, there is natural mummification by desert sand. Burying their deceased in tombs forces the Egyptians to imitate natural mummification by artificial means. Bodies are anointed with resin and wrapped with linen bandages to stop decomposition. In the Middle Kingdom, sodium bicarbonate is used to dry out the corpses. In the New Kingdom, mummification finally reaches its apogee thanks to sophisticated techniques. One example is the mummy of Seti I. He ruled Egypt about 3,300 years ago, between 1290 and 1279 BC. Even today, his distinctive facial features are easily recognizable, down to the smallest wrinkle. The result of a process that takes 70 days. Once the body is cleaned, the embalmers begin by removing the brain. To them, it's of no importance. It's the heart which is considered the seat of mind and personality. From the New Kingdom onwards, the brain is removed. Yet great care is taken not to disfigure the corpse. For if the soul does not recognize the body, life in the hereafter is impossible. So the embalmers thrust a bronze hook through the nasal cavity into the brain, squash it, and remove the mass. Many of the tools they used are preserved to this day. This is due to the fact that all objects which came into contact with the corpse during mummification were buried in the tomb too. A boon for archaeologists, as the instruments provide evidence of the expertise of embalmers and physicians.
Ancient Egyptian physicians were really good. Some of them were really so good that they had a reputation even beyond the borders of Egypt. The ancient Egyptians were very concerned about the preservation of the human body after death, for the second life after death. And this was one of the reasons why they would take out the intestines in order for the body not to disintegrate.
4 days after death, the actual embalming begins. The priests open the body on the left side and remove the organs that would otherwise hasten decomposition. The corpse is then cleansed inside and out with water and wine and treated with resin and natron. Then it rests in a crust of salt for 40 days to dry out. The embalmers then apply the same process to the organs. On the 52nd day, the body is again cleansed and dressed. The removed organs are stored in special vessels, so-called canopic jars. Usually there are 4 containers, the lids of which represent the sons of the falcon god Horus, one each for lungs, liver, intestines, and stomach. But not only organs and medical instruments are buried in the tomb. Drying agents, ointments and fabrics, even hair and nail remains are also given their place in the tomb in separate vessels. Before this, however, the final phase of mummification begins. The embalmers apply ointments and resins, expensive ingredients in ancient Egypt. When it comes to stopping decomposing bacteria, embalmers are not sparing. Then the body is wrapped from head to toe in linen bandages. Key areas of the body, such as joints, genitals, or the heart, are covered by elaborate protective amulets. In some cases, the mummy is doused once again with resins and oils.
During the New Kingdom, it's an interesting period in the embalmer's art, Egyptian mummification, because this is when they really perfected it. And the materials, the key materials, they're using natron, of course, but also you have the resins and oils and spices that were coming from as far as India, the cinnamon, for example, which is mentioned in the Bible.
Mummification is expensive and time-consuming. All the more amazing that the Egyptians spared neither expense nor effort in embalming their animals as well.
There are many different kinds of animal mummies because, of course, if you love your pet and it died, you would mummify it and place it in a tomb. Then we also have basically which are sacred animals. The idea is that each god has a totemic animal, and sometimes the god would appear on earth in animal form. And the most common form of animal mummies that we see are votive offerings. And these are offerings that pilgrims would give to the god of their choice.
About 70 million animal mummies have been found so far. Yet 1/3 of these mummies do not contain complete animal bodies. Apparently, at that time, the demand is so great that embalmers help themselves with filling materials to produce several mummies from one animal corpse. Usually, animal mummies are offered as sacrifices in temples and rarely buried with the deceased, who, after embalming, are taken to their final resting place in a procession, accompanied by priests, the bereaved, and professional mourners. Furniture, cult objects, jewelry, mummified pets, and even meals are brought along in the funeral procession. The deceased should want for nothing in the afterlife. Arriving at the grave, the ritual for revival begins. A formula addresses the bodily functions. Open your nose so that you may breathe. Open your eyes that you may see. Open your mouth that you may eat. A ritual to which the Ushepti may also be subjected. The statuettes are supposed to serve as doubles for the deceased in the afterlife, taking care of unpleasant tasks. Provided that the deceased gets there, since first he must pass several tests, which are recorded in guides for the underworld.
The pyramid texts become, the coffin texts of the Middle Kingdom, which are on the inside coffins of many noble people, and they become the Book of the Dead, which are various versions of the journeys through the afterlife. But by the late period, many very rather common low-status burials had a Book of the Dead of sorts, or parts of the books of the afterlife, the Book of the Underworld, the Book of Gates. They had some versions of these, formerly exclusively royal texts, now just buried with a common mummy.
Unlike Judaism, Christianity, or Islam, life in the hereafter does not last forever for the ancient Egyptians. The Book of the Dead also contains spells that ensure survival in the afterlife, such as the one intended to keep the body from decaying in the realm of the dead.
The Book of the Dead was a guide to the afterlife, describing in great detail what you might experience there. It was important that you could take such a book with you into your grave, since, as the Egyptians believed, the moment something was written down and you carried it with you, it was translated into reality. So even if you were a little bit uncertain, you would know how to behave correctly, since you had the Book of the Dead at hand, and thus could live on.
The Book of the Dead also explains why the Egyptians leave the heart in the body during mummification. Before entering paradise, the purity of the heart must be tested using the scales of the soul. To that end, Anubis leads the deceased into the Hall of the Last Truth. Here, the court of the dead meets under the direction of Osiris, the god of the dead.
The soul scales are an essential tool at the court of the dead. People had to prove that they had lived according to Ma'at, that they had followed the ethical standards prescribed to them. There were clear rules which called for a so-called negative confession of sin. It describes exactly what you were not allowed to do.
42 deities sit as judges in the court of the dead. Each tests the deceased for a sin, be it lying, adultery, or murder, yet also rioting and destroying food. If the deceased confirms no sins have been committed, his heart is weighed against the pen of the goddess Ma'at. If its weight is greater, it's full of sin and gulped down by the great devourer, Amit. Then the soul will be doomed for eternity. If the scales remain in the balance, the test is considered passed. The deceased may go on to paradise. A conception that's found in Christianity too, where the Archangel Michael weighs the fate of the deceased with his soul scales. The soul scales represent the striving of the ancient Egyptians to keep everything in balance. Devout Egyptians focused their lives and deeds on this final test. In the spiritual centers of ancient Egypt, the belief in the judgment of the dead is kept present in the minds of the people, as here in Thebes, now Luxor. The capital of the New Kingdom attracts tourists and scholars alike. Some of the most important mummy finds were made here in Middle Egypt. The most famous ones come from a valley west of Luxor, the Valley of the Kings. Legendary rulers like Ramses II are buried here, yet many of the burial chambers are empty. They were looted, not by modern tomb robbers, but by contemporaries. The desecration of a tomb, especially that of a pharaoh, was considered blasphemy in those days, since it condemned the deceased for all eternity.
There's a saying in Arabic, ilhamiha harmiha, which means its guardian is its thief. And evidently, the tomb robbing papyri indicate there was a whole economy to taking gold objects, for example, recycling them. There were people called traders, shutiu, who would actually take things and move about, mostly by boat, redistributing gold, and other precious things into the economy.
Therefore, around 1000 BC, the Egyptians set up mummy depots near the Valley of the Kings, so-called cachettes, galleries that were inconspicuous and difficult to access. Bodies of pharaohs and dignitaries whose tombs had become targets of robbers were reburied here. More than 40 sarcophagi are deposited in the royal cachette at Deir al-Bahari alone. Among them, the mummy of Pharaoh Ramses III. He ruled during the New Kingdom. The story of how he's supposed to have come to his death reads like a detective novel and still puzzles researchers. A cloth tied around his neck is conspicuous. In the same room, there was the mummy of an unknown young man. Since its mouth seems frozen in a cry, it's called the Screaming Mummy. Papyri from the 12th century BC relate that Ramses III fell victim to a conspiracy. The perpetrator, his own son, whom the sources call Pentawa. His motive, greed for power. Since his mother was just a concubine from Ramses' harem, her son allegedly saw his chances of ascending the throne dwindle. Did he murder his father to succeed him? New investigations may bring light into the darkness of this ancient Egyptian thriller and solve the mystery of the pharaoh's neckerchief.
Recently, work has been carried out on Ramses III mummy where they CT scanned him, and they found that he had a slit cut through his neck and that he had been murdered, and that the embalmers tried to patch him up with extra bandages and resin and even put special amulets here so that he could go into the afterlife complete.
The papyri also report on the murder trial of Pentawa. Several other conspirators are expressly named in it. Yet when it comes to the name of the alleged perpetrator, the sources do not really help. For Pentawa merely means he who bore that other name. No one is supposed to remember the regicide who, according to the protocol, is forced to commit suicide. So could the screaming mummy be the murderer of Ramses III? The poor mummification supports this theory. The internal organs haven't been removed, hands and feet are bound, and there's something unusual about the burial.
There seems to have been wrapped up in a sheepskin, which is something that you don't really see because the ancient Egyptians tended not to use sheep wool at all.
It's considered unclean by the Egyptians and is thus an additional punishment for Pentawa. 3,100 years after the murder of Ramses III, researchers may have identified the culprit. Their most important clue, the deviation from mummification standards. From the 3rd century BC onwards, the craftsmanship of embalming declined sharply. Mummification is now more like assembly line work. With the introduction of Christianity as the state religion in the Roman Empire, which includes Egypt, the practices of ancient Egyptian mummification are pushed back. They come to a complete halt with the expansion of Islam in the 7th century. The Muslim rite requires a corpse to be buried within 1 day. Ancient Egypt and its world are forgotten for a long time. It's not until the 19th century that ancient Egyptian art becomes popular among Europe's elites. Then in 1922, the fascination spreads to all classes. Howard Carter discovers the tomb of Tutankhamun. His find thrills the world. King Tut's death mask of pure gold becomes an icon of ancient Egypt. The discovery of his tomb and the splendor of its funerary goods trigger a hype. Tutmania. However, the enthusiasm overshadows the fact that Tutankhamun's mummy is not the best example of the ancient Egyptian craft of mummification.
One of the most important things in the tomb, of course, was the body of the king. And the mummy of Tutankhamun is not very well mummified. He's covered with this dark substance. His embalming cut is very big. He's missing his heart. So it is a very unusual mummification. Tutankhamun is perhaps one of Egypt's most famous kings, not because he reigned for a very long time, but because his tomb was found almost completely intact, filled with astonishing finds. And this has really captured the public's imagination.
Carter and his financier, Lord Carnarvon, sign an exclusive contract with the London Times. A reporter becomes a permanent member of the excavation team and provides readers with the latest reports of the finds. Other newspapers soon join in the race for new headlines. The lifestyle industry reacts as well. Everything must now have something to do with Egypt or mummies. Perfumes, jewelry, clothing, and much more. Hollywood, too, discovers mummies in a big way. As undead, they walk across the screen with matted linen bandages and dispense with careless adventurers.
In a museum, you can always tell where there's an ancient Egyptian collection because people flock to see the mummies, especially children, because they have a macabre interest in this. And I think people have this idea that, there's something so strange and yet compelling about looking at long dead people who are almost, because with mummies they're so well preserved, they almost seem alive to us. And it gives you a sense of connection with the past, as well as sometimes a sense of, oh, this is really bizarre.
No less fascinating are the curses and spells allegedly cast over Egyptian tombs. Howard Carter and his crew are said to have fallen victim to the curse of the pharaoh. In fact, in the years following the discovery of Tutankhamun's tomb, several members of the excavation die. yet demonstrably all of them of natural causes.
In royal tombs, there are texts that curse robbers or desecrators. But as Egyptologists keep on discovering new tombs, there is no truth to a curse of the pharaohs.
In April 2021, the world watches spellbound as 22 royal mummies are driven through Cairo in a parade. Their destination, the new exhibition rooms in the National Museum of Egyptian Civilization. Yet, should mummies be exhibited at all? Isn't it a disturbance of their peace in death?
For example, someone like Ramses II, from what we know of his character, he would have loved to be on display. He would love to have people come and bow down and look at him and say, oh my gosh, it's a pharaoh.
For the study of ancient Egypt, the world of the dead is just as important as the world of the living. For thousands of years, Egyptians spared no effort to prepare their deceased for the journey to the hereafter. Inspired by the belief in eternal life, hoping that the dead will be remembered. And that is what they succeeded in doing, perhaps better than they had ever imagined.